The evening sky shimmered with golden light as cars with shining bodies rolled one after another through the gates of a massive mansion. Inside, everything looked like a dream. Tall glass windows sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Soft music floated in the air, and the sweet smell of roses filled every corner. The mansion belonged to Mr. Roland Hayes, a man whose name was known in every corner of the city. People said he could turn anything into gold. Businesses, lands, even broken deals. He loved to show his success, and tonight was no exception. It was his grand charity gala, an event meant to raise money for the poor. Though everyone knew he loved the attention more than the giving, guests began to pour in wearing expensive gowns and suits that looked like they belonged on magazine covers. They smiled and laughed loudly, holding glasses of champagne as they compared luxury watches, new cars, and exotic vacations. The air was full of pride and perfume, laughter and gossip. Waiters in black and white uniforms moved quietly through the crowd, balancing silver trays with drinks and snacks, making sure everything stayed perfect. Among them was a young waitress named Emily Carter, a girl with kind brown eyes and hair tied neatly in a bun. She was new to this kind of event. Her hands were slightly nervous, but her smile was gentle and polite. Emily had taken this job to help pay for her mother's hospital bills. Her mother had been sick for months, and every day brought new expenses. Emily worked at a cafe in the mornings and catered at night, sleeping only a few hours between shifts. She was tired, but she never complained. She believed hard work could fix anything. Still, as she looked around the golden hall full of laughter and diamonds, she couldn't help but feel small. Everyone around her seemed to belong to another world, a world made of money and fame. While she was just trying to make it to the next paycheck, the music played louder as more guests arrived. A live band played soft jazz in one corner while photographers clicked pictures of the rich and famous. Mr. Hayes stood in the center of it all, tall, confident, and smiling proudly. He wore a dark blue suit that probably cost more than Emily earned in a year. Every few minutes someone would come to shake his hand or compliment him, and he would nod with the charm of a man who knew he owned the room. Emily moved carefully between the guests, holding a tray of sparkling drinks. "Excuse me, sir, would you like champagne?" she asked softly, offering the tray with both hands. The man barely looked at her as he took a glass. Still busy talking to someone else about stock prices, she smiled politely and walked away, reminding herself not to take it personally. It wasn't new to her. People often looked right through her as if she didn't exist, but she had learned to let it slide off like rain. In one corner of the hall stood a beautiful grand piano. Its surface shining under the lights, Emily noticed it immediately. Something about it drew her attention. She loved music, especially the piano. It reminded her of the days when life felt easier. Before her mother got sick, before bills and double shifts, her mother used to say Emily had a gift, that her music could make people feel something deep inside. But that was a long time ago. Now the only keys Emily touched were on a cash register, not a piano. Still, she couldn't help but glance at it every now and then, wondering what it would sound like if she played again. Mr. Hayes noticed the waitress's quiet movements as she passed by with her tray. He didn't think much of her, just another worker in his grand show. He was more focused on impressing his rich friends and showing off his success. He boasted about his investments, his cars, and how he had built everything from nothing, though everyone knew he inherited most of it. When people laughed at his jokes, his smile grew wider. He felt powerful. He liked to believe he was above everyone else, even the guests who admired him. As the night went on, Emily's feet began to ache. Her back hurt and her head felt heavy, but she kept moving, making sure no glass was empty and no guest had to call twice. She could hear bits of conversations about vacations in Paris, diamond deals, and luxury yachts. Words that sounded like they belonged in movies. For a brief moment, she wished she could be part of that world, not to show off, but just to stop worrying about rent, bills, and the hospital. Suddenly, a waiter beside her tripped slightly, and Emily reached out quickly to steady his tray before the drinks could fall. The guest didn't even notice, but the head waiter gave her a grateful nod. She smiled and continued working, feeling a little proud of herself for handling it smoothly. She didn't know that before the night ended. Something far bigger than spilled drinks would happen, something that would change everything. Outside, the moon shone quietly over the mansion, and the night seemed calm. But inside, beneath the laughter and the clinking glasses, fate was quietly waiting. The rich didn't know it yet, but before the party ended, A waitress would steal the spotlight and silence the entire room, and it would all begin from this very night. When a girl named Emily Carter walked into a world that never expected her to shine, the night had settled into its rhythm. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses mixed with the faint notes of jazz floating in the air. Waiters glided smoothly through the glittering crowd, offering drinks and canapes, while the wealthy guests chatted about business, travel, and luxury as if those were the only things that mattered in the world. At the center of it all stood Roland Hayes, the millionaire host, tall and sharply dressed, his smile confident and polished like a diamond. He looked around his mansion as if it were his kingdom, every guest a loyal admirer, every compliment a trophy to his pride. Mr. Hayes loved two things more than money: attention and control. He liked when people looked at him with admiration, when they whispered about how powerful and successful he was. He liked the feeling of being the most important person in the room. But beneath that perfect smile lived a man who craved superiority, who felt powerful only when others seemed small. To him, wealth wasn't just comfort, it was proof that he was better. Emily Carter, the young waitress, moved quietly around the guests, her hands steady now, her nervousness slowly fading. She had learned to read the mood of people quickly, when to smile, when to step back, when to disappear. She kept her eyes down most of the time, but she noticed everything. The way guests tried to impress each other, the fake laughter, the way no one truly listened. Still, she worked gracefully, her polite smile hiding the exhaustion behind it. Mr. Hayes watched the staff from time to time, not because he cared, but because he wanted everything to be perfect. He believed perfection reflected his success, even if it came from people he didn't respect. When his eyes fell on Emily, he frowned slightly, not because she did anything wrong, but because she didn't seem like the others. There was something calm about her, a quietness that didn't fit in his loud, glittering world. He noticed how she didn't rush, how her movements were precise, and how she never looked frightened even when other waiters seemed tense. During dinner, the guests gathered around long tables covered in silver and crystal. A toast was raised in Mr. Hayes's honor. Praising his generosity and vision, he lifted his glass, grinning with satisfaction, enjoying the sound of his name being praised. But just as he took a sip, Emily passed nearby with a tray of champagne for the next group of guests. A man suddenly turned to speak, brushing her arm slightly, and one drop of champagne spilled onto Mr. Hayes's sleeve. It was hardly anything, just a drop, but in a room where image was everything, even a tiny mistake was unforgivable. Mr. Hayes turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the young waitress. "Can you not even carry a tray properly?" he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Emily froze for a moment, her heart sinking. She immediately apologized softly. "I'm so sorry, sir." But the smirk that formed on Mr. Hayes's face showed he wasn't interested in forgiveness. Several guests chuckled quietly, enjoying the small drama. Emily lowered her head, embarrassed, her cheeks burning. "I suppose this is what happens when we let just anyone in," Mr. Hayes added, pretending to laugh, his tone sharp. The laughter around him grew, not cruel enough to be loud, but cruel enough to be felt. Emily wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. She still had a job to do, and quitting wasn't an option when her mother's medicine depended on every dollar she earned. The band played softly again, trying to smooth the atmosphere, but the moment lingered in the air like smoke. Mr. Hayes went back to entertaining his guests. Feeling proud of himself, he liked moments like this. They reminded him that he was in control, that he could bend people's emotions with just a few words. He didn't realize how that single act of arrogance would soon turn into his biggest humiliation. Emily continued her work, pretending not to notice the whispers. Her heart heavy but her face calm. She had been through worse: rejection, struggle, nights with empty plates and unpaid bills. She reminded herself of her mother's words. "When people try to make you feel small, don't fight them. Just shine brighter." It wasn't easy to believe that now, but somewhere inside she held on to those words. An hour later, Mr. Hayes decided the party needed a spark, something more entertaining. He loved being the center of attention, and what better way to do that than with a game? He clapped his hands lightly, and the chatter softened. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with a smile, "how about a little fun?" The crowd turned toward him, curious. He explained that he wanted to see if anyone in the room had a hidden talent, something impressive enough to earn a reward. He announced a $1,000 prize to whoever could entertain the crowd for a few minutes. The guests laughed and clapped, amused by the idea. But no one actually wanted to perform. Most people were too proud or too shy to risk embarrassment. Mr. Hayes chuckled, pretending to look disappointed. Oh, come on. Not one person among us dares to try. Then his eyes landed on Emily, standing quietly near the piano holding her tray. A mischievous thought crossed his mind, the kind of thought only someone cruel would find funny. How about our waitress, he said with mock excitement. Maybe she can sing or dance. We could all use a good laugh. The guest turned to Emily, smiling politely but expecting her to refuse. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands turned cold. She felt the air around her grow heavy. For a second she wanted to say no and walk away, but something inside her stopped her. She took a slow breath, then looked straight at Mr. Hayes and asked softly, "Do you still have the piano in the lounge?" The laughter faded slightly. A few guests exchanged curious glances. Mr. Hayes raised an eyebrow, surprised by her calmness. "Why, yes," he said, smirking. "You play?" Emily nodded once, her voice quiet but firm. "A little." No one in the room realized it yet, but that simple moment, that single, quiet answer, was the beginning of something unforgettable. By the end of that night, the same people who laughed at her would be standing in stunned silence, and the man who mocked her would never forget the sound of her music. For a few seconds after the last note faded, the room stayed completely still. It was as if time itself had stopped to listen. Then slowly the silence broke, not with whispers or laughter, but with applause that grew louder and louder until the hall echoed with it. Guests rose from their seats, clapping, cheering, some even shouting bravo as if they were in a concert hall. The sound filled every corner of the mansion. Bouncing off the walls like thunder, Emily sat frozen for a moment, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys, unsure whether to smile or cry. She looked around, her eyes wide with disbelief. Just minutes ago, the same people had laughed at her. Now they looked at her with admiration and surprise. Some of the women wiped away tears. The men nodded in approval, impressed by something real and raw that money couldn't buy. Emily stood up slowly and gave a small bow, her cheeks pink, her heart pounding fast but warm. She had played from her soul, not to impress anyone, but to speak the words her heart couldn't say out loud. And now for the first time she felt heard. But not everyone shared that feeling. At the center of the room, Roland Hayes stood still, his face stiff, his smile frozen in place like a mask that had cracked. He clapped once slowly, his rings catching the light, but his eyes were sharp and uneasy. He had wanted to make her look foolish, a joke for the crowd. Yet now she was the star of the evening. Every conversation, every glance, every moment of attention had shifted away from him to her, and he hated it. A guest near him whispered, "She's incredible, Roland. Where did you find her?" Mr. Hayes forced a laugh. "Oh, I try to give the little people a chance," he said, his tone light but his jaw tight. He sipped his wine quickly, trying to regain control of the mood. But as he looked around, he saw that even his closest friends weren't paying attention to him anymore. They were talking about Emily, the waitress with the golden hands. The girl who had silenced a room full of the rich. Emily didn't notice his discomfort. She was too busy trying to calm her own racing heart. A few guests came up to her, smiling warmly. One of them, an older woman in a silver gown, touched her arm gently. "My dear, that was beautiful. You must have studied somewhere wonderful." Emily smiled shyly. "No, ma'am. I just learned at home." Another man asked if she had a YouTube channel or a place to hear more of her music. Emily shook her head, embarrassed. "I just play when I can," she said softly. The attention felt strange but wonderful. For years she had been invisible, a face in the background, someone people barely saw. Now strangers were looking at her as if she was something special, someone worth noticing. It made her heart feel light. Like maybe her life could change, like maybe dreams didn't always stay dreams. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat loudly, trying to interrupt the flow of praise. "Well," he said, forcing a cheerful tone, "that was surprising." A few people looked at him, still clapping politely, but the warmth had shifted. The energy in the room was no longer his to control. He added quickly, "Quite a performance, though I suppose it's easy to impress when expectations are low." The remark was quiet, but sharp enough to sting. A few guests exchanged awkward glances. Sensing the bitterness behind his smile, Emily heard him but didn't respond. She only smiled politely and stepped back. She didn't need his approval anymore. She already had something better. Respect. The same people who had once looked through her now looked at her, And that simple change was worth more than any prize money. Mr. Hayes turned away, his pride bruised. He poured himself another drink, pretending to laugh with a few guests. But his laughter came out forced. He tried to joke, "Well, maybe I should start hiring musicians instead of waitresses. Seems more profitable." The joke didn't land. The guests gave weak smiles but quickly went back to talking about Emily. Each word about her felt like a small wound to his ego. He could feel the control slipping through his fingers, and he hated losing control. Emily, meanwhile, stepped away toward the back of the hall, her hands still shaking a little. She leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing deeply. Her friend, another waitress named Clara, rushed over, her eyes wide with excitement. "Emily, that was amazing," Clara whispered. "I didn't even know you could play like that." Emily smiled, her eyes shining. "I didn't know I still could," she said quietly. For a moment she just stood there, letting the sound of applause echo in her memory, holding on to that feeling of pride. Back in the main hall, a man in a dark suit approached Mr. Hayes. He was one of the event sponsors, a known music producer. "That girl," he said, nodding toward Emily. "Does she really work here?" "Yes," Hayes replied shortly. "Just a waitress, why?" The producer smiled. "Because she has something rare, that's real talent." Hayes forced another laugh. "Talent's cheap, discipline is expensive," he said, trying to sound superior, but inside, his confidence was cracking. The evening went on, but something had changed. The energy in the room felt different. Lighter, more human people laughed, but now it wasn't forced. They spoke softly, thoughtfully. Emily had unknowingly given them something that money and luxury never could: sincerity. And Mr. Hayes, standing in the corner with his untouched glass, realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not the most important person in his own home. As the night drew to a close, Emily gathered her things quietly. She didn't expect what was coming next, a moment that would change her life even more. But one thing was certain: she had walked into that mansion as a waitress, and she would walk out as something else, someone who had reminded an entire room that talent, grace and dignity didn't come from money or status. They came from the heart. And though Roland Hayes didn't know it yet, the story of that night, the night he tried to embarrass a waitress, was no longer his to tell. It was hers. The party was almost over, but the energy in the room had completely changed. The guests were no longer talking about business deals or luxury vacations. They were talking about her, the waitress who had sat down at a grand piano and made a room full of millionaires forget about their wealth. People were still whispering her name, their faces glowing with admiration and disbelief. Mr. Hayes pretended to be busy speaking with his guests, but deep inside, he could feel his pride burning like fire. Emily, however, wasn't thinking about him anymore. She was standing quietly near the catering table, finishing her shift. Her hands still trembling from the performance, she couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't pride. It was something lighter, relief, joy, a quiet happiness that came from doing something brave. Her friend Clara whispered, "Emily, they're still talking about you." Emily laughed softly. "I know. It feels like a dream." For a girl who had spent most of her life trying not to be noticed, it was strange to suddenly be the center of attention. Across the room, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes kept glancing at her. He wasn't like the others. His gaze wasn't filled with judgment or amusement, but curiosity. He had been at the party quietly all night. One of the sponsors of the event, his name was Mr. Daniel Brooks, a well-known music producer who had discovered several famous artists in the past. But fame didn't impress him anymore. He had seen enough fake smiles and artificial talent to last a lifetime. Yet something about Emily's performance had struck a deep chord inside him. He walked toward her slowly while Emily was wiping the table and preparing to leave. "Excuse me, miss," he said gently. His voice calm and warm. Emily turned quickly, surprised. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Did I forget something?" Mr. Brooks smiled. "No, not at all. I just wanted to tell you. That was one of the most moving performances I've ever heard." Emily froze, unsure how to respond. "Oh, thank you, sir. I really didn't mean to make such a scene," she said nervously. He chuckled. "A scene, no, my dear. You made history tonight," she laughed shyly, shaking her head. "I was just playing something I wrote a long time ago." Mr. Brooks tilted his head slightly. "You wrote that piece?" "Yes," she said softly. "When my mother got sick, it helped me cope." For a moment, His expression changed. Not pity, but respect. The kind that only comes when someone recognizes real pain turned into art. He said quietly, "That melody had emotion, honesty, something you can't teach in music schools. You either have it or you don't." Emily didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. From across the room, Mr. Hayes noticed the conversation. He saw Daniel Brooks, the famous producer, standing with his waitress, smiling and talking as if she were an equal. The sight made his stomach twist. He muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable," and walked over quickly, his fake smile plastered back on. "Well, Mr. Brooks," Hayes said loudly, interrupting them, "I see you've met our talented server." His tone carried a sharp edge, but Daniel didn't react to it. "Yes," the producer replied calmly. "Quite the discovery you have here, Roland." Mr. Hayes forced a laugh. "Oh, she's not a musician, just a girl with a hobby." Nothing serious. Emily felt the sting of his words. But before she could speak, Mr. Brooks smiled and said, "Sometimes hobbies are what change the world." "Roland." There was a hint of firmness in his voice, enough to make Hayes pause. "Well, I'll let you two chat," Hayes said quickly, stepping back, pretending to be amused, though his eyes were cold. He couldn't stand it. His own party, his own guests, and yet somehow all anyone cared about was her. Mr. Brooks turned back to Emily, lowering his voice. "Don't let people like him decide your worth." She looked at him, unsure what to say, her eyes shining with gratitude. He handed her a small card. "If you ever decide you want to make music again, real music, call me." Emily hesitated, staring at the elegant white card with his name and number printed in gold. Her heart raced. "You really think I could do something with my music?" she asked. He smiled. "You already did tonight, after he left." Emily stood there for a long moment, holding the card in her hand. The lights were dimming. The band had stopped playing and guests were slowly leaving. But to her, the night still felt alive, glowing with possibility for the first time in years. She didn't feel trapped by her circumstances. She felt something new, hope. Outside, as she walked toward the staff exit, she looked back at the mansion one last time. It still looked golden and perfect, but she no longer felt small standing beneath it. She smiled quietly, thinking of her mother. She knew exactly what her mother would say if she were here. "See, Emmy, the world can be cruel, but it always listens when you speak from the heart." Emily whispered softly into the night. "I did it, Mom." Inside the mansion, Roland Hayes sat alone in the now empty hall. The laughter had faded, the music had stopped, and the silence felt heavy. He poured himself another drink, staring at the piano that had once been a showpiece but now felt like a reminder of his humiliation. He didn't understand how a simple waitress had managed to outshine him in front of everyone. He told himself it was luck, a trick, nothing more. But deep down he knew the truth. She had something he could never buy, sincerity. Emily walked down the quiet street, her apron folded in her hand, the cool night air brushing against her face. The city lights shimmered around her, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't just walking home from work, she was walking toward something new. Her fingers itched to touch the piano again. Her heart fluttered with the thought of calling the number on the card. Maybe it was crazy, maybe it was impossible, but something inside her whispered that this was only the beginning. The night that had started as another shift for a tired waitress had turned into a turning point. And as she disappeared into the glow of the city, she didn't see herself as invisible anymore. She was ready to let the world hear her music. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Emily's small apartment. The faint hum of the city echoed outside, but inside, everything was quiet except for the sound of her mother's gentle breathing from the next room. Emily sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the white business card on the table. It looked so ordinary, yet it felt like it held a doorway to another world. The golden letters read Daniel Brooks, music producer. She traced her fingers over the name slowly, still not sure if the previous night had been real or just a dream. Her mother's voice called softly, "Emmy, did you sleep at all?" Emily smiled and walked to her room. "A little," she said. "The party was different." Her mother smiled faintly. "Different good or different bad?" Emily hesitated, then laughed. "I think it was both." She didn't mention the humiliation, or the millionaire's mocking words, only the part that mattered. The music. "I played the piano, Mom," she said quietly, and her mother's eyes widened. "You did," she whispered. After all this time, Emily nodded. "I did. And people listened. Her mother reached for her hand and squeezed it weakly. "I told you. The world would listen when you let it." Those words warmed Emily's heart more than anything else. She went back to the table and looked at the card again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up her phone, dialing the number written in gold ink. She didn't expect an answer, but after 2 rings, a familiar calm voice came through. "Daniel Brooks speaking." Emily's breath caught. "Mr. Brooks, it's Emily from last night. The waitress." He laughed softly. "Of course, Emily. I was hoping you'd call." They arranged to meet that afternoon at his small music studio downtown. When she arrived, the studio didn't look fancy like she had imagined. It was cozy and filled with instruments, guitars, violins, and a grand piano standing in the corner. Daniel greeted her warmly. "Come in, don't be nervous." Emily smiled shyly. "I've never been in a place like this before," he chuckled. "Well, that's about to change." He motioned toward the piano. "Why don't you play that piece again?" "The one from last night," Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing the keys. "I don't know if I can play it the same way twice." Daniel shook his head. "That's what makes it special." So she took a deep breath and began to play, her fingers finding the melody naturally. It flowed through the room, soft and tender, and when she finished, Daniel's eyes were moist. He said quietly, "That's not just talent, Emily, that's storytelling." She smiled uncertainly. "It's just how I feel." "Exactly," he said. "And that's what the world needs, and someone who feels." Over the next few weeks, Emily began visiting the studio regularly. She worked at the cafe in the mornings and came to play in the afternoons. Daniel helped her polish her technique, taught her how to record properly, and even introduced her to a few musicians who collaborated with her. It wasn't easy. Some days she was exhausted, her eyes heavy from long shifts and sleepless nights, but every time her fingers touched the keys, she felt alive again. It was as if music had brought color back into her gray world. Meanwhile, back in the city's elite circles, people were still talking about the night at Roland Hayes' mansion. Videos had been taken by guests and quietly shared online. Within days, clips of the Waitress pianist began spreading. People who didn't even know her name were moved by her performance. Comments flooded social media. "This music has soul. Who is she? Better than any pop song today, Mr. Hayes." Seeing the news nearly dropped his phone. He had thrown that party to boost his reputation. Yet somehow the entire internet was talking about her, not him. He tried to ignore it at first, pretending it didn't bother him. But every time someone mentioned the story, he felt that familiar sting of humiliation. He couldn't stand that his attempt to mock her had turned into a legend that made him look cruel. He even told his staff never to mention her name again. But that only made him think of her more. Back at the studio, Daniel told Emily about the viral video. She was shocked. "People actually watched that?" she asked in disbelief. Daniel smiled. "Watched, loved, and shared. You've become something special." "Emily," she covered her mouth, laughing nervously. "I don't even know what to say." "Say thank you," he said, smiling. "And start preparing. People are going to want more." They began working on her first official recording. Daniel helped her compose a new piece inspired by her life. A song about struggle, hope, and the strength to rise again. When she recorded it, the melody carried all her emotions. The night she cried quietly. The morning she worked tired, and the moment she dared to play again. When the song was released online, it spread faster than anyone expected. People from all over the world left messages saying her music made them feel something deep, something real. One evening, as Emily sat in the studio watching the play count rise, she whispered, "I wish Mom could see this." Daniel smiled. "She already does, through you." She looked out the window, the city lights flickering like stars, and for the first time, she didn't feel like the girl who served drinks at someone else's party. She felt like someone who belonged to her own story. The same girl who had once been laughed at had now found her voice. And the world was finally listening. Across town, Roland Hayes sat in his empty mansion again. The same piano standing silently in the corner. He walked past it, but this time he didn't feel proud. He felt small. He thought about that night, about how easily she had taken everything he valued, attention, admiration, respect, without even trying. He poured himself another drink. Staring at his reflection in the glass for the first time, he realized that money could buy applause but not meaning, and that was something Emily Carter had found without a single dollar. The city was buzzing with music, Billboards, social media pages, and radio shows were all talking about a mysterious young pianist named Emily Carter. Her melody, the one she had played at the Millionaire's party, had reached millions of hearts. People said her music felt real, that it reminded them of life before fame and noise. In a world full of flashy songs and fake glamour, her sound was like a breath of truth. Emily's days had changed completely. She still woke up early, still took care of her mother, but now there was something new in her life, purpose. Every morning she went to the studio, working on new songs with Daniel Brooks. Her fan base grew every day. People sent letters, emails, and messages thanking her for making them feel something genuine. She read them all, often with tears in her eyes, not believing that her simple melody could reach so many souls. One morning, she received an invitation from a well-known TV network. They wanted her to perform live on a national talk show. Daniel was thrilled. "This is it, Emily, this is your moment," he said with a proud smile. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the letter. "What if I make a mistake?" Daniel chuckled. "You've already made the world fall in love with your mistakes. That's what makes you real." She laughed softly, feeling both nervous and grateful. Meanwhile, in a different corner of the city, Roland Hayes sat in his office, staring at a newspaper headline. "From Waitress to Wonder, Emily Carter's piano story inspires millions." His jaw tightened as he read the article. His name was mentioned too, but not kindly. It described how his arrogant behavior accidentally led to her discovery. The headline might as well have said, "Millionaire's mockery turns into his downfall." For the first time, Roland felt something new. Regret. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the ceiling. His mansion, once filled with parties and people, now felt empty. The same guest who once surrounded him for favors now avoided his calls. He had become a symbol of pride turned sour. And the irony hurt. The waitress he tried to humiliate had risen higher than he ever could. He couldn't stop thinking about her music, about that night, about how she had played with such pure emotion that even he had been silenced. Days passed, and the night of the TV show arrived. The studio was filled with bright lights, cameras, and the quiet hum of excitement. Emily stood backstage in a simple white dress, her hair tied back neatly, her hands cold but steady. Her mother was in the audience, sitting in a wheelchair, her eyes shining with pride. Daniel stood beside her, smiling warmly. "Just play like you did that first night. Play for your mother." Emily nodded, whispering, "Always." The host introduced her. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the girl who touched the world with her piano, Emily Carter." The audience erupted into applause. Emily walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment. She sat at the piano, closed her eyes, and began to play. The melody that flowed from her fingers was new but familiar, gentle yet powerful. It spoke of struggle, forgiveness, and grace. Each note carried a story: the tired waitress, the cruel laughter, the quiet courage, and the sweet victory. As she played, the cameras zoomed in, capturing every emotion. People watching from home could feel it too. They didn't just hear music, they heard truth. When the final note lingered in the air, the audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, crying. Her mother's tears ran freely. Daniel wiped his glasses, pretending not to cry. Emily stood, bowing humbly, her heart overflowing with gratitude. Across town, Roland Hayes watched the broadcast alone in his living room. The same piano from that night sat silently beside him. He couldn't look away from the screen, his eyes locked on the girl he once mocked. As she finished her song and smiled through her tears, something inside him broke. The wall of arrogance he had built for years. He set his glass down and rubbed his face, whispering softly, "I was wrong." The words felt strange on his tongue, but real. The next day, Roland did something no one expected. He called Daniel Brooks, who was surprised to hear his voice. "Roland Hayes here," he said quietly. "I need to speak to Emily." Just once, Daniel hesitated. "Why?" Roland sighed. "Because I owe her an apology and maybe more," Daniel agreed. "On one condition, you meet her humbly, not as a millionaire, but as a man." Roland paused, then said softly, "That's the only way I can face her." A few days later, Emily walked into the same mansion where everything had started. It looked different now, quieter, less golden, more human. Roland stood by the piano, looking smaller than she remembered, his eyes tired but sincere. "Emily," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you for coming." She smiled politely. "Mr. Hayes?" He took a deep breath. I was cruel that night, I was proud, and I tried to humiliate you. He looked at the piano, his voice trembling. But you taught me more in one song than I've learned in a lifetime of success. Emily said nothing, just listened, her expression gentle but firm. He continued, I wanted to ask if I could help your foundation. The one Daniel told me about, the charity for hospital patients. Emily blinked. Surprised. You want to help? He nodded. Yes, not to clear my name, but because you reminded me what giving really means. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was calm this time. Not heavy, finally. Emily smiled softly and said, Then maybe we both learned something that night. Roland nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. Maybe we did. As Emily left the mansion, the sunlight spilled through the windows. She felt a strange sense of peace, not just for the forgiveness she had given, but for the growth she had seen. The girl who once entered this house as a waitress now walked out as an artist, an inspiration and a woman who had turned pain into power. Her journey wasn't over. It was only beginning. And somewhere behind her, a humbled millionaire sat at his piano, trying for the first time to play a song not for fame but for meaning. Weeks passed and Emily's world bloomed like a sunrise. Her music was no longer just a sound, it had become a movement. People from all corners of the world shared her story. The waitress who played her pain and turned it into beauty. Her songs were now played in hospitals, schools, and charity concerts, touching hearts that had long forgotten how to feel. Everywhere she went, people thanked her not just for her music, but for her courage. Her foundation, named Hearts in Harmony, was officially launched. It provided free music therapy for patients recovering from illness, especially children and the elderly. Daniel Brooks helped her build it, and together they worked day and night to make it something real. Emily often said, If my music can help one person smile through their pain, it's worth everything. Her mother, though frail, attended every small concert Emily performed, sitting proudly in the front row, her eyes shining like stars. One evening, Emily performed at a charity gala, not as a waitress, but as the honored guest. The stage was decorated with white roses, the air filled with quiet anticipation. The audience wasn't there for wealth or glamour. They were there for hope. As she took her seat at the piano, the crowd went silent. She began to play a new composition, The Night That Changed Everything. Each note carried her entire journey, from humiliation to healing, from struggle to success. The music was not just heard, it was felt. Deep in every listener's heart, among the audience sat Roland Hayes, no longer the proud millionaire but a humbled man. He had kept his promise to support her foundation and had donated generously. But quietly, without publicity, he didn't seek credit, he sought peace. When he listened to her play, his eyes grew moist, not from guilt anymore but from gratitude. He realized that the girl he once mocked had saved him from his own emptiness. Her music had shown him something money never could. Grace, after the concert, as guests mingled, Roland approached Emily backstage. He looked older but gentler, carrying a small box in his hands. I wanted to give you this, he said softly, handing it to her. Inside was a golden bracelet with a small piano charm and the words, Never forget where you began, engraved inside. Emily looked at it for a long moment, touched beyond words. Thank you, she said quietly. But I think I already learned that lesson. He smiled. I know. I just wanted you to remember how far courage can take a person. They stood there for a moment, not as waitress and millionaire, not as shame and forgiveness, but as two people who had both been changed by a single song. Roland looked at her with genuine respect. You reminded me that kindness is the only thing that truly makes us rich, Emily smiled warmly. And music is how we remember it. He nodded slowly, and for the first time his eyes looked peaceful. Months later, Emily's music album was released, a collection of songs inspired by her life. Each track told a story, not of fame but of human strength, of quiet battles fought in silence. The world embraced it, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Critics called it soul and sound, and her name became known not as a celebrity, but as an artist with heart. Emily never let success change her. She still visited her mother every morning, still smiled at strangers, still spoke softly to everyone she met. She believed her gift was never hers alone. It was something she was meant to share. One afternoon, she visited a children's hospital that her foundation supported. She brought a small keyboard and sat with a group of kids, "Who wants to learn a song?" she asked playfully, and a dozen little hands shot up. Laughter filled the room, and soon tiny fingers pressed the keys, creating their own little melodies. She watched them smiling, thinking about the night that had started it all, one cruel moment that had led her here. She realized that sometimes pain is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of something greater. As she packed her things, one little girl tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Emily, when I grow up, I want to play just like you." Emily knelt down and smiled. "Then you already can, sweetheart. You just have to play with your heart." The girl grinned and ran back to the piano. Pressing the keys with excitement, Emily stood there watching, her eyes shining with quiet tears. That was the real reward. Not fame, not applause, but moments like this. Moments where her music became someone else's courage. That night, back home, Emily sat by the window again, looking at the stars. Her mother was asleep in the next room. Peaceful and smiling, the city was quiet. Yet somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear her own melody being played. Maybe in a cafe, maybe on the radio, she smiled to herself. Whispering softly, "We did it, Mom." She knew her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt whole and far away in a quiet mansion. Roland Hayes sat at his piano. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play, slowly, carefully. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The same music that once humbled him now healed him, note by note. He looked up at the framed newspaper article on his wall, "Waitress who played her way to the world's heart," and smiled. Because even in his wealth, he finally understood the simplest truth. Greatness isn't measured by what you own, but by what you give, and somewhere between the melody and the silence. Two souls, on one who once served and one who once ruled, had both found redemption, all because of one song, one night, and one girl who dared to play.